I want to talk about voice. Two essays that you are reading this week address the issue of voice. One is the piece by Lamott, Finding a Voice. The other is the piece by Isaac, She, the essay as a warm body. For me, one of the most important factors in being a successful writer of literary nonfiction is voice. Voice is probably the hardest literary element to define, yet it remains the most important, at least for me, in essay writing. What do we mean by voice in literature? Well, think of it this way. Think of the voice inside of your head in your most private moments. When you're alone in a dark room, say, or alone in the woods, or alone in a park, that voice that is inimitably you, that voice that no one can imitate, with your own rhythms, your own nuances, your own subtleties, your own idiosyncrasies, weirdnesses, difficulties. But also then think about how difficult it is to translate that deep inner voice to the page or to your speech. When we speak and when we write, we are largely influenced by the pop cultural mainstream. Think of how many TV shows you have seen, how many films you have seen, how many podcasts you have listened to, how many advertisements you have witnessed. And these forces create linguistic conventions that allow us to communicate with one another easily, but these conventions often push us into the realm of cliche and commonplace and abstraction. In other words, these mainstream linguistic conventions are averse to what is most powerful in voice in creative writing. So, what we need to learn to do as writers is to push through those cliches, to push through those commonplaces, and try to get to that voice that is you and only you. Now, think of it from another angle. If one of your friends decided to play a joke on you and called you and pretended to be, say, one of your parents, and say this friend was a very good mimic and could come very close to actually capturing the voice of the parent that she is mimicking. For all the skill in mimicry, there's something missing. What is it that's missing in that imitation? What is it that your mom or dad, what is it that they have in their voice that an imitation can't capture? Think of a professional mimic, a professional impersonator who's impersonating an actor or a singer you really like. What is it that the imitation can't quite catch? Well, it's difficult to describe that, but that's a way of thinking about voice. Another way of thinking about voice is think about the people you find most interesting. What makes them interesting? Well, part of what makes them interesting is they're unpredictable. You don't know what they're going to say next necessarily, or they'll say surprising things, or they'll take something familiar and make it feel unfamiliar, or something unfamiliar and make it feel familiar. You want to be around that person. You like to listen to that person because the voice is pleasing, it's exhilarating, it's exciting. If you can capture that kind of verbal energy in your writing, that would be another way of thinking about voice. So on the one hand, voice is extremely personal and interior, but on the other hand, voice is performative. You might choose a different kind of voice depending upon what kind of piece you're writing. If you're writing a humorous piece, well, you will choose a humorous voice. If you're writing an ironic piece, you would choose a more ironic voice. In other words, that deep interiority we have is not one unified voice. We have many voices within us, and we have many voices at our fingertips when we sit down to write. Now, I like to think of voice very simply in terms of proximity. The video that YouTube took down, on that video, I played a little bit of Johnny Cash singing his famous song Big River, and then I played a little bit of Bob Dylan and the band covering that song some 15 years later. And I talked about the different voices. And I talked about how Johnny Cash in that song Big River, it's a voice that's very close to the material. The feeling in that song and the voice in that song seem to be one. You can imagine that voice front and center singing with conviction. In other words, the feeling of the song and the voicing of the song seem almost to be one. Whereas when you listen to the Dylan song, there's distance between the feeling in the song and the voice of the song. Dylan sounds as if he might be being ironic or parodic or just playfully and lazily singing the song. There's a distance between his voice and the subject matter. And when there's a distance, you have room for irony and satire and so on and so forth. If there's closeness to the feeling from the voice, then you often have more of a sense of the essay as being authentic and raw. So there are all sorts of ways to think about voice. And when we start workshopping our essay, we will think about these three different ways I've talked about voice. Voice as idiosyncratic interiority, voice as something you can perform in an essay to give it a certain quality, and voice as what brings you close to the subject matter or can pull you back from the subject matter. Voice as a tool of positioning. Now, these are only three ways to talk about voice. As we talk about the text in our class, the essays we're reading, the professional essays, I'll call them, we'll talk about voice a lot. And when it comes down to your own writing, we'll talk about voice a lot. The main way, though, and this is the fourth point I wanted to make, to express your voice is to describe experiences that have happened only to you in the most concrete, specific language possible. If you can do that, you will break through cliche, you will break through commonplace, you will break through generality, and you will capture what is distinctive about your experience, and you'll describe it in such a way that is also distinctive. And you'll be further on to developing a strong literary voice. In other words, voice suggests an I, a subjectivity, but what really reveals voice sometimes is what the eye sees. So the specificity and the concreteness of your descriptions of your experience will reflect the distinctiveness of your subjectivity.